You might have noticed the last few weeks in America, or last few years really, have been awful. People legitimately hate each other here. Last week, a sitting congressman from Iowa, Steve King, appeared to be openly clamoring for civil war in his public-facing social media. Apparently, he's bragging that the red states would win, apparently forgetting that the state he represents actually was blue in the last election. That's how far we've gone down the path of forgetting who our friends and neighbors are. Many of us can no longer recognize who it is we live with or imagine that we have shared and common values with them. I sometimes try to remember the last time it seemed like collectively we were truly happy. I think I know when it was, actually. There were 3 weeks in the June and July of about 2016 when Pokemon Go had just been released. In those glorious moments, strangers could be seen walking arm in arm with each other. Every park in America, people of different political persuasions, different races, different everything. Just hunting for Squirtles and Psyducks together. Our public spaces were overrun because they all had the same single goal. They wanted to hunt pretend animals to add to their digital collections. None of the rest of what was going on in the country mattered because, as odd as it sounds, the simplicity, the utter stupidity of that one single desire was a uniting force. That silly thing was fun, and that was a truth that everyone could enjoy in the same uncomplicated way. Unfortunately, nothing else since that time has been as easy. Ever since the fall of 2016, everything's been increasingly divisive. Every social, political issue has been pushed to the breaking point until we're all ready to fight each other. As I'm sure you're aware, our intelligence community believes this was the precise objective of a foreign power, Russia. You might have heard of it. The knowledge that we were attacked in this way is sort of profound, because in order to conceive of an operation of this kind of scale, the operatives of the Russian government had to study us and understand us. They had to understand our social divisions. It's paradoxically an attack that can only be born of a certain sort of radical empathy, because you can't exploit something that you don't understand within people. Russia was able to fully leverage something inside people here in America that we try to hide from ourselves, often because pretending these divisions exist or pretending they don't exist is a way to be nice, right? We can just pretend that we don't have things that we disagree about to talk to each other. My response to the knowledge that this had happened to us was a little atypical. It occurred to me, I didn't know anything about the Russians. I was barely 5 years old when the Berlin Wall fell, which is a big marking point for when the Cold War ended. And so Russians had sort of been relegated to the role of movie villains my entire life. It was people like Ivan Drago from Rocky IV, or the Colonel from Rambo First Blood. Maybe the Russians just hated Sylvester Stallone, I don't know. The Soviets were never really scary to me because they'd been defeated when I was a child, so they were always a joke. They're sort of a group of has-beens with delusions of grandeur. And yet here they were, again, apparently manipulating my friends, my neighbors, my loved ones into hating one another. And I decided if a large portion of my adult life was going to be defined by a conflict with the Russians, then I couldn't understand the world without knowing who they were. And so I decided late one Saturday night that I was going to teach myself Russian and try to learn the stories that they tell each other. In the process, my eyes were suddenly opened to an entirely new view of the world. My goal was to learn Russian, but in actuality, I became aware for the first time of all the subtle, invisible ways that my perspective was shaped unconsciously. Only in seeing the contrast was I able to appreciate how much my native language and everyone's reality as a result is constructed by this lens in which they are born. I want to give you a couple examples of this to sort of make my point. The first is really simple. It's about how we see color. When I was a kid, I remember having what I thought was sort of a radical idea that not everyone sees color the exact same way, that my dad was looking at the sky and what he said was blue was actually what I saw as green, sort of this crazy idea. And some well-meaning adult came along and told me some boring science facts, that every light is a wavelength, and when it hits your retina, it transforms in your brain, and blah, blah, blah. And as our great American poet Eddie Vedder tells us, once you've traded magic for fact, there's no trade backs. But as I was learning Russian, I realized pretty early on that the Slavic conception of the color wheel was actually very different than mine. Along with basic colors like yellow and red, I'd learned a comparatively small distinction between dark blue, or sini, and light blue, or goluboy. And I wasn't being asked to learn shades of other tones early on. This was fundamental to the way in which you had to think about color. So I started asking questions for some friends I knew who taught this, and in the process, I learned that in the Russian mind, these weren't different shades of color, but they were totally different colors from one another. That's just as different as red and orange might be to me. So I did some research and I learned that all those years ago, some well-meaning adult lied to me. In actuality, color is not a universal experience. Professors Brent Berlin, who's an anthropologist, and Paul Kay, who's a linguist, actually conducted a comprehensive study on this topic in the 1960s and discovered that different languages have access to a different number of color words. Cultures evolve their perception of color over time according to the needs of what it is they have to describe. Some cultures only have 2 color words. They distinguish between light and dark. That's it. If a language gets to 3 colors, it's always red. And if a language gets a 4th and a 5th color, it's always yellow and green. So on and so forth. Blue and its shades actually come along pretty late. There's a lot of evidence that ancient cultures didn't actually have a perception of blue at all. In the Odyssey, Homer describes the sea as wine dark rather than blue or green, or anything that we would recognize as describing the color of the sea in modern literature. There's no mention of the color blue at all in the Icelandic sagas, the Quran, the ancient Hebrew Bible. The only culture who has appeared to develop a word for blue thousands of years ago is the Egyptians, who incidentally were also the only civilization who had a process to produce blue dye for their colors, for their clothing, I should say. You see, without a reason to interact with the concept of blue, people literally don't see it because it doesn't get a name. And without a name, you don't perceive it exists. That wavelength of light might as well be outside your visual spectrum. It ends up merging in your mind into the light and dark. To me, this was kind of mind-blowing. We all learn our colors in kindergarten, the earliest stages of our education. But how we classify them and how we perceive them is entirely a construction of our mind. So when I look at a painting or a flower and I try to describe it to somebody, I'm not saying something that's true. I'm saying that something that's constrained by my concept, by my limitations of how I conceive the world. It turns out the more words you know, the more nouns you know, the more concepts you've named, the richer your world actually becomes. Giving voice to more ideas changes your process of cognition. We literally can't view the same world as the people around us because in the lens of our mind, it's constrained by what we think we know. The other example I want to give you is even more profound because in my mind it describes our relationship to objects in a way I didn't perceive. It's built directly into the structure of the Russian language, and I think this one's easier to understand visually, so I made a few slides. In English, if I want to tell you I have this microphone, it's my microphone, I would just say that, I have a microphone. The sentence feels really simple. I'm the subject of the sentence. Ultimately, I'm talking about me, bringing it around to number 1. But by contrast, the microphone's the object. And what I'm communicating is possession of that object. It's something exclusive. The microphone exists for me. By contrast, the Russian version of this sentence is structurally very different. It gets the same basic idea, but it communicates it in an alien manner. A Russian might say, "У меня есть микрофон," and in this sentence, the microphone is the subject. It has its own existence. It's entirely independent of me. And there is no word in this sentence that means have it all. The preposition at the front, the "u," only describes proximity, and the verb in the middle actually means to be. It merely says that the microphone exists, and the part of the sentence that refers to me is actually just talking about where the microphone is located. I'm not the star of the idea in any way. I'm merely a place in space where the microphone exists as an independent object. So in this translation, and if you pop this exact sentence into Google, it will tell you it means I have a microphone. Expresses something fundamentally pretty different. It means at me there is a microphone. Now, I don't want to oversell this and tell you that the Russians don't have a concept of personal property. I mean, they do. But it's fascinating that the structure of how they think about objects and their relationship to it gives them an independent existence and a life. This microphone doesn't exist to be owned or used by me. It has a meaning completely separate and apart from my experience of it. This distinction is fascinating. I often find myself wondering if the very Western political obsession with private ownership of everything has some root in the way we think about these objects and our relationship to them. And in seeing this, I realized for the first time that the way I think about things reflects an attitude I didn't even know I had and had been living with for decades. These are just a couple of examples. There's dozens of these, and people teach whole graduate classes on this. Learning Russian was something that I thought I'd get a couple of interesting insights from. Maybe learn a couple new stories like Vasilisa. But then one day, something kind of strange happened in my non-Russian life. I'm an attorney professionally. I occasionally have to take depositions, and later I go back and read the transcripts to make sure I remember what people said. And after a while, I started noticing that the way in which I asked questions in these depositions had changed. The Russian language is obsessed with the distinction between process and result. So every verb comes in pairs. The first verb is about the act of doing something, and the second verb is about the result of doing something. So Russian speakers are constantly distinguishing between these two ideas when they're picking which words to use. And suddenly, in my depositions, I was always picking between these two ideas as well, even though I was speaking English. More than understanding the words and the ideas, I'd unlocked an entire mode of thought that I didn't have before. I started out with the goal of understanding the Russians, and instead Russian, the language, changed me at my core. The truth about this culture wasn't something I could find, but a force that acted on me as a person. And this has changed my belief about what words are, at kind of a fundamental level, and what happens when we speak to each other. In my view, words are essentially cryptograms. We have a thought in our mind, we encode it, put it in a bunch of letters and syllables, and send it off to somebody else. And we hope that they can decode the same thing we mean. It's honestly astonishing that we don't have more miscommunication than we do this way, because what I say and what you hear are two different things. With this in mind, I want to make some suggestions for how we can speak to one another about those difficult topics that are dividing us, instead of just sweeping our differences under the rug and pretending they don't exist. We need to keep in mind as you use that if we want to be effective advocates for the more just and peaceful world that we all want, it's less important to focus on what we are saying than what the person we're talking to is hearing. Because if we say something that's true to us, but sparks a negative association for someone else, the conversation's over. They don't want to listen to us anymore. We've lost the ability to be good advocates. And it means that we have to do the very thing that the Russians have proven able to do to us on a large scale. We have to imagine what the people we're talking to care about and then tailor our message to them. We need to hear our words with their ears before we even start to speak. Otherwise, no matter how much you feel something deeply, you might be talking to them about a color that they can't see. When you do this well, you can bring everyone back to a space, even temporarily, where it's possible for your worldviews to converge again. I'm not going to pretend this is easy. It's a lot of work. But if you practice, it's a lot more effective than you can imagine. I'll give you a practical example. So during the 2018 election, I actually did a fair amount of canvassing. This meant I would talk to people who frequently didn't want to see me. I showed up at their door, knocked on them, and they didn't expect it. And so they'd rant at me as a captive audience about every conceivable opinion they had. Everything from NATO to healthcare to vaccines. And the most effective response I ever came up with was just simply asking them, why does this issue matter to you? You'll be amazed how jarring this is when you ask people. People stop talking to you when they think about it because they're so used to repeating a script they've heard about what their opinion is, or they're so used to having someone tell them what they want them to think, that they've never actually given that introspective thought. It invites a moment for them to think about what it is they feel and what it is they believe. And a lot of people are dying for the opportunity for someone to ask them what it is they feel. Defensiveness melts away. The one caveat to this is you have to actually mean it when you ask. Part of practicing empathy is you have to make yourself care about what the other person thinks. The question can't be smarmy, because people can read a phony a mile away, but it does work, and it works really well. I've tried this tactic in a lot of other forms, with coworkers, family members, social media, and I tend to have far more productive conversations with other people, particularly those who disagree with me when I start, simply because that first step, asking them why they care about a thing, starts the process of opening up a space of intimacy, where people will actually tell you what it is they fear and they worry about, what their concerns are and why they see the world the way they do. True engagement means accepting that learning about another person or another culture means that they might change you too. It means emotional vulnerability in a way that humanizes everybody instead of otherizing them as your adversary. And loving your neighbor means treating them and their desires as fully real. Once we're there, we can understand what people actually want. Conflict seems simpler and less irresolvable. This is what Russian gave me, a completely new way to see the world, and the belief that if we want to truly understand our neighbors, we can. Real advocacy and real knowledge isn't just about knowing your own truth. It's about temporarily stepping into the truth of another person. Thank you.